All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is the Professor Jamsheed Choksy. Professor Choksy is a distinguished professor of Iranian and Central Eurasia Studies in the Hamilton Lugar School of Global and International Studies, and he is the director of the Eurasia and Uralic National Resources Center at the Indiana University. Well, Professor Choksy, and welcome back to The Missing Piece.
Thank you for having me.
Well, Professor Choksy, again, as I mentioned in the intro, the news headline came out recently that mentions Iran's supreme leader directly reject nuclear talks with the US as European negotiations remain unmoved. Let's start from the beginning, Professor Choksy. From your perspective, how do we assess right now this relationship between Iran and the US regarding the nuclear talk at this moment? And why do you think it is crucial for us to understand this rejection, again, not only come from the Iran's supreme leader, but also send a strong message to the US? Your thoughts?
That's a good question, Will. And I think the way to approach it is to understand that Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, remains in power by balancing the various political factions within Iran. So when he makes a pronouncement, it is directed not only to, let's say in this case, an international audience for the US, it's also directed to the then prevailing power tensions within Iran. So, yes, on the 23rd of this month, we had him make a public comment that further nuclear negotiations with the United States would not serve any of Tehran's interests, and that, as far as he was concerned, it was at a dead end. But I would say that we need to take those comments in a long-term perspective. This is not the first time he's made such comments. What he tends to do is to hedge his own political bets. In other words, there are factions within Iran. There are factions right now, and particularly right now, after the war with Israel, after the US bombing of the nuclear sites, after the assassination of Iranian scientists, the hardliners who are against negotiations are particularly vocal. And so what we see the supreme leader traditionally do, even in the best of diplomatic circumstances, even when he does say, yes, go ahead and negotiate, he always says, well, go ahead and negotiate, but I don't think any good's going to come out of it. So for him to make this comment he's sort of essentially placating the hardliners, at the same time sort of saying, well, for those of you who want to negotiate, keep in mind if it fails, you'll get blamed. I, as supreme leader, can say, look, I warned you.
Professor Choksy, you are a historian and you are also a political scientist. But when it comes to the word negotiation, I want to ask the question because today, especially when we talk about international affairs or international relations, people tend to mix up of two words. One is negotiation, another one is compromise. So from your perspective, especially from the standpoint of the US at this moment, I mean, again, don't get me wrong. The current Secretary of the State, Marco Rubio, made it so clear during numerous occasions that Iran, or it is crucial for Iran to give up the nuclear programs, and so that the conversation and the dialogue will be rather productive and meaningful for both sides. But at this moment, Professor Choksy, from your perspective, how do we distinguish between compromise and negotiation at this moment? So in other words, is US actually seriously negotiating with the Iranian side? Or US today, it's only particularly looking for this type of compromise so that the dialogue will become more meaningful? Your thoughts?
And that's a good point, because I would say that when we talk about negotiations, all negotiations, by their very nature, have to involve degrees of compromise. And that compromise occurs between parties. If not, it's not a negotiation. It's a demand, or it's a one-way street, or it is enforced action. The tensions, I would think, I think there are different negotiating stances and different tensions. The United States has traditionally wanted to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons, not from preventing them from developing nuclear energy, because let's keep in mind, the beginnings of the Iranian atomic program go back to a U.S. assistance. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, it was called Atoms for Peace. It was a U.S. program that set up the Tehran nuclear reactor for peaceful energy purposes. So the U.S. has one stance. Israel has another stance, which is no nuclear capability at all, because after all capabilities have dual use. So there's that, a more extreme position. Iran's position has traditionally been, and its very public position has been, that it seeks peaceful nuclear energy capabilities, not weapons capabilities. So the question is, how does one thread that negotiation needle with compromise so that Iran keeps its stance, the US achieves its stance, and Israel does not have to worry about a weapon? So that has been the crux of the problem. That's also been not just the external crux, but the internal debate in Iran between those who want indeed for Iran to have a nuclear weapon, let's say along the lines of North Korea, or others in Iran who say, look, let us be more open about our program so that Iran can overcome the UN sanctions, EU sanctions, US sanctions, and return economically to the West. And right now, Khamenei's words are directed in response to the pressure Iran is feeling from the EU snapback sanctions. So remember when the JCPOA was agreed to, even though the US has now left the JCPOA, the Europeans are still technically in it. And under that agreement, if the Europeans believe that Iran is not working in good faith with the International Atomic Agency, the Europeans can bring about these snapback sanctions. And as a result, this is what we are seeing, the tensions in Iran, the tensions with Europe. So that's where we are right now. And the question remains, how do the various parties move beyond the current tensions to try once again to reach agreement? And it's complicated by the US, by Israel, by the EU, but it's also complicated between the dispute within the ruling party of Iran. Those who want to prevent further sanctions by compromise. There are those who are willing to take the internal problems in order to, shall we say, demonstrate to the Iranian people that they can stand up to the world.
Professor Choksy, again, let's go back a little bit further. When we talk about the nation of Iran, trace it back to the first term of Donald Trump. And then that continue as Joe Biden's presidency. Now, 2025, we're living the second term of the Trump's presidency. Putting everything together, even I dare to mention during Obama's presidency, when we talk about Iran's the relationship with the US, one of the approach that throughout the entire presidencies under different presidents, it's what we called a dual track diplomacy, and which means that US has been trying really hard to engage with the government, but on top of all that, also engage with the civil society, business owners, or business students, and even political oppositions. But again, Professor Choksy, pull back the curtain. Look at what's happening right now. How do you think that US today is pursuing this dual-track diplomacy not only through the governmental conversation, but also through the civil society. I want to ask that question before we talk about the role of the Europeans. Your thoughts?
That again is a very interesting question, because what we have seen through all those different US administrations you mentioned are fluctuating and sometimes even conflicting attempts to engage the Iranian public, to engage the Iranian business community, to engage Iranian students. And right now, we stand, shall we say, a more uncompromising, less dual tracks position from the United States, from the Trump administration. We've seen, shall we say, further crackdown on Iranians coming to the United States, on Iranian companies engaging in the world. So, shall we say, the stance of the United States administration has hardened towards the Iranian public. And I will say that that may actually, in the long run, not be as productive as the current US administration seems to think it will be. There are multiple ways to approach this. One is to say, look, let's put pressure on the Iranian public, on Iranian students, on the Iranian business community, so that they in turn then put pressure on their government to bring the government back to the negotiating table. That may work, that may not work. At times that works, at times it doesn't. Right now it may not be working because the Iranian government, the hardliners, are more in charge and therefore are less willing to listen to their own public.
Well, Professor Choksy, let's talk about the role of the European nations. Again, since the direct talk between US and Iran has fallen out, now experts believe the nations such as France, Germany, and even UK began the process of reimposing sanctions on Iran very soon, or perhaps it is still in place. So, Professor Choksy, from your perspective, and one more thing, I do want to mention that a quote came from the current French President Emmanuel Macron and said, and I quote, that Middle East region can only be at peace if Iran's nuclear program is once again fully under control. I want to ask a very simple question. Maybe you know the answer. Maybe you and I have already talked about it. In order to ask Iran to give up or to have the, for the US or the European countries to have a full control of the nuclear program, is that simple a pipe dream, or that is something that with the support of US, European countries could accomplish collectively? Your thoughts?
That I think is the crux of this issue, and you really nailed it on that point. So let me address it in this way. What the European countries have done, these so-called snapback sanctions, part of them, of course, is what has occurred in the past. That is, embargo on conventional weapons. That has fluctuated over the years. A ban on nuclear enrichment materials that reaching Iran, that has also been in place on and off. Restrictions on equipment for Iran's conventional missile program, that has been in place. What I think has come back with more force with these snapback sanctions are travel bans of Iranians to Europe, and also the freezing of commercial and government assets that Iran has in Europe. That's what really hurts the Iranians. And we can see the consequences right away. As soon as the snapback sanctions were reimposed, the Iranian currency, the rial, fell to essentially an all-time low against world currencies. It is almost 1,100,000 rials to the US dollar at this point. So essentially, what the snapback sanctions are doing is that they're further hurting Iran's domestic economy, and what the Europeans are hoping is that that pressure on the Iranian economy will force the Iranian people to turn to the regime and say, look, you can have domestic enrichment so long as it is for commercial, civilian energy purposes, but you have to be completely transparent in terms of your nuclear program. And there is actually cause for concern because, yes, the United States tried to destroy Iran's nuclear program. It damaged it by the very best of assessments, even the US assessments. It could not destroy it. But what we do know subsequently is that despite all those endeavors, despite the Europeans, etc., Iran is now building yet another site a few miles south of Natanz, buried even deeper into the mountain ranges. And Iran has said that that's where they're going to set up their next generation of centrifuges, etc. So what Iran is essentially doing is it's telling the world that it's going to defy. And so this is part of the problem, is how does one convince the regime that the regime can remain stable, that it doesn't need nuclear weapons, that ultimately, in a real sense, one can argue no one needs nuclear weapons because the use of nuclear weapons will be catastrophic around the world. And so that's the crux of the problem. And we've talked about the US, Israel, the EU, but there are other global powers and there are other regional powers. And the question is, what role, I would ask, what role can those regional and global powers also play in convincing the regime in Tehran that it can remain in power, that it can stay safe, but what it does need to do is open up its weapons programs to international inspection, so that then it can continue its civilian nuclear program.
Professor Choksy, let's trace back the previous answer that you mentioned a country, North Korea. Now, we know that today, when we talk about Iran, when we talk about North Korea, just on this particular nuclear weapon development side, that I want to read something to you. Again, it's all about North Korea, but I think we can get the similar message, or at least from the US perspective, is trying to get the similar signal, not the noises, from the nation of Iran. When a question regarding the purpose of nuclear weapon development for North Korea, the government has always pinpointing for self-defense. And the current leader of North Korea reinstated the position during their speech that he brought it up and again mentioned, and I quote, "Becoming a nuclear armed state was an indispensable choice taken at the crossroads between our nation's survival and extinction," end quote. Professor Choksy, this is a bold statement and it's such a strong declaration from North Korean government to the world. Now, shifting our conversation to Iran, I might be wrong or I might be so naive about this, but again, Professor Choksy, you are the expert. Do you think that the nation of Iran or the leader of Iran, it's echoing the similar statement to the world to say nuclear weapon development, it's not a threat to the world, but for self-defense? And becoming a nuclear armed state, it's rather indispensable for the nation's survival and the extinction. What do you think of that?
I think we can read a similar mindset into the current regime in Iran. The difference is that the current regime in Iran has never claimed that it wants or intends to develop nuclear weapons for self-defense or for offense. The position, even as the current leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, even as he was rejecting negotiations, he reiterates that Iran is not developing nuclear weapons. In other words, the position of Iran has been, we don't need nuclear weapons for survival. We don't intend to develop nuclear weapons. And yet, the general consensus of their actions is that they are developing it. So it would appear that they feel they need it for regime survival, as does North Korea. That is for defensive and maybe if necessary for offensive purposes. However, the messaging is different. Whereas North Korea is overtly clear about its intentions, whether offensive or defensive. Iran takes the position that it does not need nuclear weapons, that it is not developing. And so given that stance, then the question comes up, well, if that's not what you're doing, then what are you doing? Why are you creating these sites? Why are you burying your centrifuges? Why do you not open them up for weapons inspection? The inspection is certainly not by the US, it's certainly not by Israel, it's by the United Nations, right? And since Iran subscribes to the United Nations, just like all the other superpowers, the question is, why not then be overt? And I think it's that cat and mouse attitude of Iran that is also one of the problems. If this new site was open to inspection, inspectors go in, they certify that yes, it is indeed for civilian purposes, etc. There's monitoring. I think tensions would subside, the sanctions would gradually go away, and Iran could indeed pursue a civilian nuclear program. And if I may say we talked about North Korea, we've talked about the US, but let us also bring in the other dominant superpower at this point, China. Okay, and China has very good relations with Iran. I think one role, I know that China traditionally does not like interfering in the domestic matters of countries.
That's right.
Fair enough. I think the Iranian nuclear issue, however, is no longer a domestic matter. It is a matter of international concern, international tensions. So perhaps a role that Beijing can play with Tehran is to urge Tehran to be more transparent. That, in other words, to exercise its global clout, to urge that Iran, because the Iranian nuclear file has multinational ramifications, and we are seeing its constant tensions. Maybe one way to break this deadlock is for China to re-engage, just as it did with the JCPOA and other negotiations, and to say, look, we can play a constructive role, providing assurances to Iran, at the same time convincing the Iranian regime that it is in the Iranian regime's interest to return to the global community.
Well, Professor Choksy, I want to end our conversation by asking you the last question. I am very glad that you brought China into our conversation, because when we look at this global order, or I even dare to use the word called the global governance, people tend to say that China these days not only is generating noises, but also China has specific goals and aims to accomplish by the end of 2025. You're right, Professor. There's no surprise and there's no denying that the current nuclear weapon development and also what's happening in Iran, it's not only a matter for the US, but also for nation of China as well. But we know that when we talk about any politics or any political game, there's a word called reciprocity. China would love to reach out this olive branch to Iran and would love to soften the tension with the US. But at the end of the day, what do you think China is trying to accomplish at this moment? And certainly we know in China there's a saying that which means that fish and steak, you cannot have both. You gotta pick one or another. And also we know there's no free lunch. So why is China will be interested in not meddling, but helping, supporting this nuclear weapon debate? But also, what is China expecting in return? Your final thoughts.
So let me take your metaphor and give you the American counterpoint. The American counterpoint is called surf and turf. In other words, that you can indeed eat seafood and meat together, and that it can be a delicious combination, not cooked together, cooked separately, but on the same plate. And so that metaphor can also be brought into it. And what in engaging, what would China get in return? China is a global player. China's involvement in helping resolve a long-standing tension between Iran on the one hand, the EU, the US, and Israel on the other hand. All countries with which China does have relations, it would be beneficial to China's global standing. In addition, the mitigating of tensions means that a volatile region of the world becomes a little more stable, the Middle East. The Persian Gulf, which is still a major hub for energy supplies, becomes a little more secure. And the global order gets reinforced. And China's role in the global order gains even greater stature. So what is it for China? I would say that's what's in for China. And the benefits, I would say, would outweigh, because part of the problem right now is the United States and Iran do not have direct diplomatic ties. They don't have embassies. The US works through Gulf nations like Oman, the Emirates, through the Swiss, through other intermediaries. Iran contacts the US in that way as well. The lack of that direct communications is problematic. The Iranians tend to be more suspicious of the Europeans, understandably, because of all the tensions. So I would say that could be a possible role for China in helping solve what has become almost more than 4 decades long problem, and one which I think would eventually benefit everyone, the Iranian people, the Chinese people, the American people, and also just, shall we say, bring down the level of tensions. The 12-day war between Iran and Israel did no one any good.
You're right, Professor. I mean, again, I agree with you 100%. We don't want to see the tension continue to escalate. Because, again, at the end of the day, it does no good for the international community.
Yeah.
But meanwhile, it doesn't matter China is looking for a free lunch or China is looking for a steak. But I believe after the pandemic, as we continue to pay attention to the global order, it's all members are critical. Every single player is critical. No one should be isolated and no one should be selfish. Well, ladies and gentlemen, again, it's such an honor to have Professor Choksy on the show. Again, Professor Choksy is a distinguished professor of Iranian and Central Eurasian Studies. I strongly encourage everyone to go online to connect with Professor Choksy. Again, Professor, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure, and we'd love to have you back on the show for future episodes. So thank you so much
for
doing this.
Thank you.